The red dust of Arizona territory stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the jagged silhouettes of distant mesas that rose like ancient sentinels against the pale morning sky. The year was 1883, and this was a land that forgave nothing, not the weak, not the unprepared, and certainly not those foolish enough to believe mercy could be found in its sun-scorched embrace. Maybelle O'Connor pressed her face against the grimy window of the trading post, watching the wind whip spirals of sand across the main street of Copper Creek. At 19, she had learned to make herself small, to move quietly through the world so as not to draw attention from her father's bourbon-soaked rage or the hungry stares of men who saw her as little more than a commodity. "Get away from that window, girl." The gravelly voice of her father, Ezra O'Connor, cut through the stifling air of the cramped room behind Murphy's General Store, where they'd been living since losing their homestead to drought and debt 3 months prior. "Ain't proper for you to be gawking at folks." Maybelle turned slowly, her calloused hand smoothing the worn fabric of her only decent dress, a faded blue cotton that had once belonged to her mother. God rest her soul. Ezra sat slumped in a wooden chair, his weathered face flushed with the telltale signs of another morning spent with his bottle. His clothes hung loose on his diminished frame, and his once proud shoulders now curved inward like a man carrying the weight of 100 regrets. "Pa, I was just nothing." His bloodshot eyes fixed on her with the familiar mixture of resentment and calculation that had become his default expression since her mother's passing 2 years prior. "We got business to discuss, and you'd best listen good." A chill ran down Maybelle's spine despite the oppressive heat. When her father spoke of business, it never boded well for her. She had watched him sell their furniture piece by piece, then their animals, then finally the land itself, all to feed his thirst for liquor and to pay debts he'd accumulated at poker tables in every saloon from here to Tucson. "There's a man coming," Ezra continued, his voice taking on the wheedling tone he used when trying to convince himself, as much as others, that his latest scheme had merit. "Name of Colt Hartley. Owns a spread up in the high country, north of here. Big operation. Cattle, horses, the works." Maybelle's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She had heard whispers about Colt Hartley in the few months they'd been in Copper Creek. The rancher was spoken of in hushed tones, his name carrying with it a weight of mystery and fear that made even the hardest men in town shift uncomfortably when the conversation turned his way. "What's he want with us, Pa?" Ezra couldn't meet her eyes. Instead, he reached for the bottle beside his chair, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled the cork. He's looking for a wife. Been alone up there for nigh on 5 years since his woman died. Needs someone to keep house, tend to things." The words hit Maybelle like a physical blow. She gripped the windowsill behind her, her knuckles white against the peeling pane. "Pa, no, you can't mean I don't got no choice." The words exploded from him with such force that spittle flew from his lips. "You think I want this? You think any father wants to—" He trailed off, his momentary flash of guilt quickly replaced by defensive anger. "He's offering good money. Maybelle, horses, gold, supplies, enough to clear my debts and give me a fresh start." "And what about my fresh start?" The words came out stronger than she'd intended, surprising them both. "What about what I want?" Ezra's face darkened. "What you want?" He rose unsteadily from his chair, and Maybelle instinctively stepped back, knowing the signs of his building rage. "You want to keep living in this storeroom? You want to watch me drink myself into an early grave? You want to end up like your mother, married to a failure who can't provide for his own family?" The mention of her mother cut deep, as he'd known it would. Sarah O'Connor had died of a fever that might have been treatable if they'd had money for a proper doctor instead of relying on patent medicines and prayer. At least she married for love. Maybelle whispered, "Love." Ezra spat the word like it tasted bitter. Love don't put food on the table or keep the roof from leaking. Love don't pay debts or buy medicine when you're sick. Hartley can give you a good life, better than anything I can provide. Before Maybelle could respond, heavy footsteps sounded on the wooden steps outside, followed by a measured knock on the door. Both father and daughter froze. the weight of the moment settling over them like a burial shroud. "That'll be him," Ezra said quietly, suddenly looking older than his 52 years. "Remember, girl, be respectful. Don't give him cause to change his mind." The door opened to frame a man unlike any Maybelle had ever seen. Colt Hartley stood well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders filling the doorway as he removed his black hat to reveal dark hair streaked with premature silver. His face was weathered by wind and sun, carved into sharp angles that spoke of a life lived hard. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch, pale blue like winter ice, holding depths that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. He wore simple clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt open at the collar, and a leather vest that had seen better days. A gun belt rode low on his hips, the worn grip of a Colt .45 visible in its holster. Everything about him spoke of quiet competence and barely leashed power. "Mr. O'Connor." His voice was low and measured, with the slight rasp of a man who chose his words carefully. Mr. Hartley." Ezra stepped forward with the overeager manner of a man trying too hard to appear confident. Welcome. This here's my daughter. Maybelle, make your curtsy to Mr. Hartley." Humiliation burned in her cheeks, but Maybelle dipped a small curtsy. Keeping her eyes downcast, she could feel Hartley's gaze on her, studying her with the same intensity she'd seen men use when evaluating livestock at market. "She's a good girl," Ezra continued, his voice taking on the practiced patter of a salesman. "Strong, hard-working, can cook, clean, sew, all the things a man needs in a wife. Ain't been with any men, neither, if you catch my meaning." "Pa!" Maybelle's mortification was complete. "Quiet, girl." Ezra shot her a warning look before turning back to Hartley. "She'll do right by you, Mr. Hartley. I guarantee it." Hartley's expression remained impassive as he continued his assessment. Finally, he spoke. "Turn around." The command was spoken quietly, but there was no mistaking it for anything but an order. Maybelle's eyes flew to his face, searching for some sign of humanity, some indication that he saw her as more than a purchase to be evaluated. She found none. Fighting back tears of rage and helplessness, she slowly turned in a circle, feeling his eyes catalog every detail of her appearance. When she faced him again, his expression was still unreadable. "She'll do," he said finally, as if commenting on the weather. He reached into his vest and withdrew a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. "2 horses, as agreed, plus $30 in gold. They're tied out front." Ezra's eyes lit up with greedy anticipation as he reached for the pouch, but Hartley's next words stopped him cold. "She comes with me now." "Now?" Ezra blinked in surprise. "Don't you want to... That is, shouldn't there be some kind of ceremony? Paperwork?" "We'll see to that later." Hartley's tone brooked no argument. He looked at Maybelle, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker in those cold eyes. Regret, perhaps. Or maybe just impatience to have the business concluded. "Get your things. Miss O'Connor, we leave within the hour." Maybelle stared at him, the reality of her situation crashing over her like a cold wave. In less than an hour. She would leave the only life she'd ever known to follow this stranger into the wilderness, bound to him by nothing more than a financial transaction between men who saw her as property to be traded. "I don't have much," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's fine." Hartley placed his hat back on his head, the gesture somehow final. "What you need, we'll get. What you don't, you'll learn to do without." As he turned to leave, pausing only to shake hands with her father and finalize the exchange of money for flesh, Maybelle caught sight of herself in the small mirror hanging near the door. The young woman staring back at her looked small and frightened, her green eyes wide with uncertainty and her auburn hair escaping from its careful bun. Within the hour, she would mount one of Hartley's horses and ride north into the high country, toward a life she couldn't imagine and a future that stretched before her like the vast, unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory itself. She only prayed she would be strong enough to survive whatever awaited her there. The journey to the Hartley Ranch took the better part of 2 days, winding through terrain that grew increasingly wild and unforgiving with each mile they traveled north. Maybelle had never ridden such distances before, and by the end of the first day, every muscle in her body ached from gripping the saddle of the gentle mare Colt had provided for her, a chestnut with kind eyes that he called Rosie. They spoke little during the ride. Colt maintained a steady pace, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon and the rocky outcroppings that could hide Apache raiding parties or bandits desperate enough to attack well-armed travelers. When they stopped to rest the horses, he would help her down without ceremony, his touch impersonal and brief, before seeing to the animal's needs with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. On the second evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold, they crested a ridge that looked down into a sheltered valley. There, nestled against a backdrop of towering pines and red sandstone cliffs, stood the Hartley Ranch. The house was larger than Maybelle had expected, a sprawling structure of adobe and timber with a wide veranda that wrapped around 3 sides. Outbuildings dotted the property, a substantial barn, a bunkhouse, corrals filled with horses, and what appeared to be a blacksmith's forge. It was a working ranch, prosperous and well-maintained. Speaking of years of hard labor and careful planning, "This is home," Colt said simply, the first words he had spoken in hours. As they rode down into the valley, Maybelle noticed the absence of other people. No ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse to tend their horses. No housekeeper appeared on the veranda to welcome them home. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the ridge. Colt dismounted and moved to help her down from Rosie's back. His hands were gentle but impersonal as they encircled her waist, lifting her as easily as if she weighed no more than a child. For a moment, she found herself close enough to smell the masculine scent of leather and sage that clung to him, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the desert sun. Then he set her on her feet and stepped back, the moment broken. "I'll see to the horses," he said. "Go on inside. There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry." Maybelle approached the front door on unsteady legs, her heart hammering as she placed her hand on the heavy wooden handle. This was it, the threshold of her new life. Once she crossed it, there would be no going back to the girl she had been, however miserable that existence might have been. The door opened to reveal a spacious front room dominated by a massive stone fireplace. Heavy wooden furniture sat arranged with masculine practicality. No feminine touches softened the harsh lines or brought warmth to the space. Everything was clean, but somehow lifeless, as if the house were holding its breath. A layer of dust covered the mantelpiece, and cobwebs gathered in the corners where a woman's careful attention had not reached in far too long. This was a house without a woman's touch, a house where a man lived alone with his memories and his regrets. Maybelle moved deeper into the house, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. The kitchen was well appointed with a large cast-iron stove, a pump for water, and shelves lined with preserves and dry goods. Someone had been maintaining the basics of life here, but without joy or care beyond mere survival. She found bread and salt pork, enough for a simple meal, and set about preparing supper with hands that trembled only slightly. Cooking was familiar, comfortable, one of the few skills her hard life had taught her that might prove useful in this strange new world. When Colt entered 20 minutes later, he found her at the stove, stirring a pot of beans she had found soaking in the pantry. He had washed at the pump outside, she noticed, and his dark hair was damp and slicked back from his forehead. "Smells good," he said, and she thought she detected a note of surprise in his voice, as if he had forgotten what it was like to come home to the scent of cooking food. They ate in silence at the long wooden table, the space between them feeling vast despite the intimate act of sharing a meal. Maybelle found herself stealing glances at his face, trying to reconcile the man she had expected, brutal, demanding, frightening, with the reality of this quiet, solitary figure who seemed more haunted than threatening. After supper, Colt rose and moved to a cabinet near the fireplace, returning with a bottle of whiskey and a single glass. He poured himself a measure and settled back in his chair, his pale eyes studying her over the rim of the glass. "You'll have the room at the end of the hall upstairs," he said finally. It was... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "It's a good room. Gets the morning sun." Maybelle felt something twist in her stomach. The room at the end of the hall? Not his room. Then, not yet. Perhaps not ever. She didn't know whether to feel relief or something else she couldn't quite name. "What happened to your wife?" The question escaped before she could stop it, and she immediately wished she could call it back. His face went rigid, the glass freezing halfway to his lips. "She died," he said, his voice flat and final. "I know that. I mean she died. And that's all you need to know about it." His tone brooked no argument, but Maybelle caught something in his eyes, not anger, but pain so deep and raw that it made her chest ache in sympathy. He drained his whiskey in one swallow and stood. "I'll show you to your room. Morning comes early here, and there's work to be done." The room he led her to was indeed bright and airy, with windows facing east toward the rising sun. It was also clearly a woman's room. The bed was covered with a faded quilt in shades of rose and cream, and a dressing table sat beneath one window, its surface empty but for a silver brush and mirror that had been polished to gleaming. "This was her room," Maybelle said softly, running her fingers along the smooth wood of the dressing table. "It was." Colt's voice came from the doorway, where he stood without entering. "Her name was Elizabeth. She would have wanted. She was always taking in strays. Said everyone deserved a soft place to land." With that, he was gone, leaving Maybelle alone with the ghost of the woman who had lived and loved and died in this room. She sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the strangeness of her situation. Here she was, installed in a dead woman's room, married to a man she didn't know, in a house that felt more like a shrine than a home. That night, as she lay between sheets that smelled faintly of lavender and loss, she heard sounds from elsewhere in the house, the creak of floorboards, the soft thud of a door closing, and once, carried on the night wind, the sound of a man's voice speaking too low to make out the words, but heavy with a grief that seemed to permeate the very walls of the house. She pulled the quilt up to her chin and stared at the ceiling, wondering what she'd gotten herself into and whether she was strong enough to survive it. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, their voices joining in a chorus of loneliness that seemed to echo the ache in her own heart. The morning came with the pale light Colt had promised, streaming through the eastern windows to wake her gently. She dressed quickly in her one decent dress and made her way downstairs, where she found him already in the kitchen, drinking coffee from a tin cup and staring out at the mountains beyond. "There's work to be done," he said without preamble. "Garden needs tending, chickens need feeding, house needs attention. Can you handle that?" "Yes," she said, grateful to have something concrete to focus on. "I can do that." He nodded once, then moved toward the door. "I'll be out with the cattle most days. You'll be on your own here. There's a rifle above the fireplace if you need it." "Do you know how to shoot?" "A little," she admitted. "We'll work on that. This country doesn't suffer the unprepared." He paused at the threshold, his hand on the doorframe. "Maybelle." It was the first time he had spoken her name, and something in the way he said it made her look up sharply. "Welcome home," he said quietly, and then he was gone, leaving her alone in the kitchen with the scent of coffee and the echo of words that might have meant everything or nothing at all. As she began her first full day at the Hartley Ranch, Maybelle tried to push away the memory of that moment and the way her heart had jumped when he spoke her name. She had more immediate concerns, like learning to live in the shadow of a dead woman's memory, and trying to understand the man who had brought her here to this beautiful, lonely place at the edge of the world. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm as steady and predictable as the sunrise that painted the eastern mountains gold each morning. Maybelle rose early, tended the vegetable garden that Elizabeth had planted years before, fed the chickens that provided eggs for their simple meals, and worked to breathe life back into a house that had been merely existing rather than living. She had grown accustomed to Colt's long absences during the day, when he rode out to check on the cattle scattered across his vast holdings or to repair fencing damaged by storms or wild animals. He would return as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks, his clothes dusty and his face weathered by wind and sun, speaking little but nodding his appreciation when he found a hot meal waiting and clean clothes laid out for the morning. It was a lonely existence, but not an unkind one. Colt made no demands on her beyond the basic maintenance of the household, treated her with distant courtesy, and never once raised his voice or his hand in anger. Yet the very restraint of his behavior only served to remind her that she was there on sufferance, a purchased convenience whose place in his world was defined by transaction rather than affection. On a morning when the early autumn air carried the first hint of winter's approach, Maybelle gathered her courage and approached him as he prepared to ride out for the day. "Mr. Hartley," she began, then stopped, flustering under his steady gaze. Even after 3 weeks, she found it difficult to meet those pale blue eyes directly. "What is it?" His voice was not unkind, merely matter-of-fact. "I was wondering, that is, I thought perhaps," she took a deep breath and tried again, "I'd like to learn to ride properly. And to shoot." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "Why?" The simple question caught her off guard. Why indeed? "This is wild country," she said slowly, thinking it through as she spoke. "If something happened to you, or if trouble came while you were away, I'd be helpless. I don't want to be helpless anymore." For a long moment, he studied her face as if seeing something there he hadn't noticed before. Then he nodded once, decisively. "Can you be ready in an hour?" "Ready for what?" "Your first lesson." An hour later, Maybelle found herself in the largest of the corrals. Facing a sturdy bay gelding that Colt had introduced as Duke, the horse was smaller and calmer than the stallion Colt rode. But to her inexperienced eyes, he still seemed enormous. "First thing you need to understand," Colt said, his voice taking on the patient tone of a man who knew his business, "is that a horse is a partnership. You don't master him. You come to an understanding." He showed her how to approach Duke calmly, how to read the signals in the set of his ears and the tension in his muscles, how to saddle him properly and check the cinch. His hands guided hers as he demonstrated the correct way to hold the reins, and she found herself distracted by the warmth of his touch and the way he smelled of leather and the outdoors. "You're not paying attention," he said quietly, and she realized she had been staring at his hands rather than listening to his instructions. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, heat flooding her cheeks. "Sorry won't keep you from falling off a cliff or getting thrown by a spooked horse." But his tone was gentler than his words, and when she looked up, she thought she saw something almost like amusement in his eyes. The riding lessons became a daily ritual. Each morning after the chores were done, Colt would appear with Duke saddled and ready, and they would spend an hour working on her seat, her balance, her ability to communicate with the horse through subtle shifts of weight and pressure. At first, she was stiff and nervous, clutching the saddle horn and tensing at every movement. But gradually, under Colt's patient instruction, she began to relax into the rhythm of Duke's gait, to trust in her own ability to stay mounted, to feel the first stirrings of the freedom that came with being able to move across the landscape under her own power. "Better," Colt said one morning as she guided Duke through a series of figure eights in the corral. "You're starting to think like a rider instead of a passenger." The praise, sparse as it was, warmed her more than it should have. After 2 weeks of corral work, he declared her ready for trail riding, and they began to explore the vast reaches of his property together. These rides became the highlight of Maybelle's days, hours spent moving through landscapes so beautiful it took her breath away, following game trails through stands of aspen that blazed gold in the autumn light, climbing to overlooks that provided views of country that seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. During these rides, Colt began to talk, Not about himself or his past, but about the land itself. He showed her how to read the signs that indicated water ahead, how to spot the movement of animals in the brush, how to navigate by the position of the sun and the shape of the mountains. He taught her which plants were safe to eat and which could kill, how to build a fire that would burn hot and clean, how to find shelter when the weather turned dangerous. "This country will test you," he said one afternoon as they rested their horses beside a small stream that tumbled down from the peaks above. "It doesn't care if you're strong or weak, rich or poor, man or woman. It only cares if you're smart enough to survive it." Is that what happened to Elizabeth? The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately regretted it when she saw his face close off. But this time, he didn't shut down completely. Instead, he stared out at the distant mountains for a long moment before speaking. Elizabeth she was fearless, too fearless. Maybe she loved this country like it was a person, trusted it to keep her safe. His voice was quiet, reflective. But the country doesn't make bargains. It just is what it is. It was the most he had ever said about his dead wife, and Maybelle sensed that pushing for more would be a mistake. Instead, she sat quietly beside him, watching the play of light on the water and feeling something shift between them. Not intimacy, exactly, but a lessening of the distance that had defined their relationship since that first day. The shooting lessons began the following week. Colt started her with an old Navy Colt that had belonged to his father, teaching her to load the chambers, to hold the weapon steady, to squeeze the trigger rather than jerking it. Her first attempts were disastrous. The recoil knocked her off balance, and her shots went wide of even the largest targets. "Don't fight the gun," he said, moving behind her to adjust her stance. His chest pressed against her back as he reached around to position her arms, and she found herself struggling to concentrate on his instructions. "Let it be part of you." Gradually, her accuracy improved. She learned to anticipate the kick, to breathe properly, to focus on the front sight rather than the target. The day she finally managed to hit the center of the target they had set up against a hillside, Colt's rare smile was reward enough for all her frustration. "Not bad," he said, and coming from him, it felt like high praise indeed. It was during one of these practice sessions that they were caught by an early autumn storm. One moment they were working on her draw speed in a sheltered meadow. The next they were surrounded by towering thunderheads that seemed to have materialized from nowhere. "We need to get to shelter," Colt said, scanning the sky with the practiced eye of a man who knew the dangers of lightning in high country. "There's an overhang about a quarter-mile up the ridge." They reached the shallow cave just as the first fat raindrops began to fall, leading their horses into the protected space and settling in to wait out the storm. The overhang was barely deep enough for them to sit upright, forcing them into closer proximity than they had shared since that first night in the house. Thunder rolled across the peaks like artillery fire, and lightning illuminated the world beyond their shelter in stark, momentary clarity. Duke and Colt Stallion, Ranger, stood calmly with their backs to the storm, but Maybelle couldn't help flinching at each crash of thunder. "First big storm?" Colt asked, noticing her reaction. "Not the first, but it feels different out here, bigger somehow." "Everything's bigger out here," he agreed. The storms, the silences, the distances, the mistakes, too. Rain began to fall in earnest now, creating a curtain of water at the mouth of their shelter. In the confined space, Maybelle became acutely aware of Colt's presence beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way drops of rain had darkened his hair, the masculine scent of him that was becoming disturbingly familiar. "Tell me about before," she said, partly to distract herself from his proximity. "Before Elizabeth died. What was it like?" For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, surprisingly, he began to speak. "Different. The house was alive, I suppose. She filled it with music and laughter and flowers from the garden. Always had some project going, teaching herself to paint or trying new recipes or writing letters to her sister back in Missouri." His voice grew soft with memory. "She wanted children. We were trying." The pain in his voice was raw, immediate, and Maybelle felt her chest tighten with sympathy. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. He didn't pull away, but she felt him tense at the contact. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I shouldn't have asked." "No, it's all right." He looked down at their joined hands, and for a moment the careful distance he maintained seemed to waver. "Sometimes I think I've forgotten what her voice sounded like. Then I'll catch a scent or hear a sound, and it all comes flooding back." Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and in its brief illumination Maybelle saw something in his face that made her breath catch, not just grief, but longing, and perhaps something else she didn't dare name. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. As they prepared to ride home, Colt turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Maybelle," he said, then stopped, as if the words he wanted to say were stuck somewhere between his heart and his throat. "Yes?" "Nothing. We should head back before another storm builds." But as they rode home through the sweet-smelling air, Maybelle carried with her the memory of that moment in the cave, the warmth of his hand under hers, the sound of her name on his lips, and the growing certainty that the careful walls he had built around his heart were beginning to show cracks. That night, she lay in Elizabeth's bed and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her, wondering what it would take to bring this wounded man back to life, and whether she had the courage to try. As October painted the aspen groves in shades of gold and amber, Maybelle found herself settling into a rhythm of domesticity that felt both foreign and surprisingly natural. The house, which had seemed like a mausoleum when she first arrived, began to show signs of life under her gentle ministrations. It started with small things, wildflowers gathered during her morning walks, and arranged in a mason jar on the kitchen table, curtains washed and rehung to let in more light, the accumulated dust of years carefully cleaned from corners and surfaces that had been neglected since Elizabeth's death. She found herself humming as she worked, old songs her mother had taught her, filling the silence that had reigned over the house for so long. In Elizabeth's sewing basket, she discovered spools of thread in every color imaginable and fabric remnants that spoke of interrupted projects, working by lamplight in the evenings after Colt had retired to his study with his whiskey and his silence. Maybelle began to piece together a new tablecloth from the scraps, not to replace what had been, but to add something of her own to the mix. The embroidery came slowly, her fingers remembering skills her mother had taught her during the brief, happy years before drink and disappointment had claimed her father. She worked roses and vines along the border, choosing colors that would complement the faded wallpaper in the dining room, creating something beautiful from fragments of the past. Colt noticed the changes, though he said nothing directly. She would catch him pausing in doorways, his pale eyes taking in the flowers or the way afternoon light now streamed unobstructed through clean windows. Once, she found him standing at the kitchen table, his fingers tracing the edge of the tablecloth she was working on, his expression unreadable. "It's beautiful work," he said quietly when he realized she was watching from the doorway. "Thank you." The words came out barely above a whisper, but he heard them, and something in his face softened slightly before he turned away. Their evening routine had evolved as well, where once he had disappeared into his study immediately after supper. He had begun lingering at the table, accepting a second cup of coffee and even occasionally offering brief comments about his day or asking about hers. The conversations were still stilted, careful, but they were conversations nonetheless. It was on one such evening, as the first snow of the season began to dust the peaks visible through the kitchen window, that everything changed. Colt had been later than usual, returning from the south pasture, where he had been working to bring the cattle closer to the ranch buildings in preparation for winter. When he finally appeared in the doorway, Maybelle was startled by his appearance. His clothes were soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his skull, and he was shivering despite his obvious attempts to control it. "Good Lord, what happened to you?" she exclaimed, rising from her chair where she had been waiting with his supper kept warm on the stove. "Caught in that weather," he said through chattering teeth, gesturing toward the window where snow was now falling in earnest. Stream was higher than expected. Duke slipped, crossing back. "You're soaked through. You need to get out of those clothes before you catch your death." The words came out more sharply than she had intended, born of genuine concern rather than criticism. For a moment, he looked as if he might argue, but another violent shiver seemed to convince him otherwise. "I'll go upstairs and—" "You'll do no such thing. Those stairs are cold as a tomb, and you'll be frozen solid before you reach your room." She moved toward him with the decisive efficiency she had learned during her mother's final illness. "Sit down by the stove. I'll get some blankets. Maybelle, I can—" "Sit down. Colt Hartley. Before you fall down." The use of his given name surprised them both. She had never called him anything but Mr. Hartley, maintaining the formal distance he seemed to prefer. But concern had overridden propriety, and now it hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. He sat, and she bustled around gathering blankets from the chest in the front room, putting water on to heat, and fetching the bottle of whiskey from his study. When she returned, he was attempting to remove his shirt with hands that shook too badly to manage the buttons. "Here, let me—" She set down her armload of supplies and moved behind his chair, her fingers working at the stubborn fastenings. His shirt was plastered to his skin, and she had to peel it away carefully, trying not to notice the play of muscles beneath or the way her touch seemed to affect his breathing. When she came around to drape a blanket over his shoulders, she found herself closer to him than she had ever been, close enough to see the flecks of silver in his dark hair, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin despite his chill. Their eyes met and held for a moment that stretched between them like a taut wire. "Better?" she asked softly. "Better," he agreed, but his voice was rough with something that had nothing to do with the cold. She busied herself preparing a hot drink, whiskey mixed with honey and hot water, another remedy from her childhood. When she handed it to him, their fingers brushed, and she felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with static from the wool blanket. "Drink," she ordered, settling into the chair beside him with her own cup. "All of it." They sat in companionable silence as the warmth from the stove and the whiskey did their work. Color gradually returned to his face, and his shivering subsided. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical and strange. "This is how it starts," he said eventually, staring out at the swirling white beyond the window. "Winter. Once it begins up in the high country, there's no stopping it. We could be snowed in for days at a time before spring comes again." The implications of his words settled over her slowly. Days alone together in the house, with nowhere to go and nothing to do but exist in each other's company. The thought should have been daunting, but instead she found it oddly comforting. "Are you worried about the cattle?" "Some. Most are in the lower pastures now, but there are always a few strays that think they know better." He smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "Reminds me of someone else I know. Are you comparing me to a cow, Mr. Hartley?" "Colt," he said quietly. "After tonight, I think you can call me Colt." The simple permission felt like a gift, intimate and precious. "Colt," she repeated, testing the sound of it on her tongue. They finished their drinks in a silence that had become comfortable rather than awkward. When Colt finally rose to go upstairs, he paused beside her chair. "Thank you," he said, "for all of this." Before she could respond, he leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead in a kiss so gentle it barely registered as contact at all. But the warmth of it lingered long after he had gone, spreading through her like honey in her veins. That night, Maybelle lay awake listening to the wind howl around the eaves and the soft whisper of snow against her windows. From somewhere in the house came the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth, as if someone else were having trouble sleeping. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the world transformed by a blanket of snow that made everything look new and clean. Colt appeared for breakfast looking rested despite what she suspected had been a restless night, and they fell into their usual pattern of quiet conversation over coffee and eggs. But something had shifted between them. Some invisible barrier had been lowered. He asked her opinion about things, whether she thought the weather would hold, what supplies they might need if they were indeed snowed in. Small things, perhaps, but they made her feel like a partner rather than an obligation. Over the next few days, as the snow continued to fall intermittently, they found themselves spending more time together, with the outside work limited by the weather. Colt took to sitting in the kitchen while she cooked, sometimes reading aloud from week-old newspapers that had arrived with the last supply wagon, sometimes just watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. It was during one of these companionable interludes that disaster struck. Colt had been attempting to repair a loose board on the kitchen ceiling when the makeshift ladder he was using, 2 chairs stacked precariously on top of each other, gave way beneath him. The crash brought Maybelle running from the pantry where she had been taking inventory of their supplies. She found him sitting on the floor amid the wreckage of the chairs, his left hand pressed against his right shoulder, his face pale with pain. "Don't fuss," he said before she could speak, but his voice was strained. "Just took a tumble. Let me see." She knelt beside him, gently pulling his hand away to examine the injury. His shirt was torn, and blood seeped from a nasty gash where his shoulder had connected with the corner of the overturned chair. "It needs cleaning," she said, rising to fetch water and clean cloth, "and probably stitching. You can sit still and let me tend it. Or you can explain to the neighbors why you bled to death from sheer stubbornness." Her tone brooked no argument, and to her surprise, he subsided without further protest. Cleaning the wound required her to help him out of his shirt, and she tried to maintain a clinical detachment as she worked, but it was impossible to ignore the strength evident in his broad shoulders, the scars that told stories she didn't know, the way he held himself still under her ministrations despite what had to be considerable pain. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked as she began the delicate work of stitching the gash closed. "My mother. She tended anyone who needed it back home, said suffering was suffering, and it didn't matter if you were rich or poor, human or animal." Her hands were steady despite the intimacy of the moment. "Hold still. I'm almost finished." When she was done, she bound the wound with clean linen and stepped back to survey her work. "There. It should heal clean if you don't do anything foolish to tear it open again." "Thank you." His voice was soft, and when she looked up, she found him watching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Maybelle, Whatever he had been about to say was lost as he reached up with his good hand to touch her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized was there. The gesture was so gentle, so unexpected, that it broke something loose inside her chest. And then, as if drawn by forces neither of them fully understood, he leaned forward and kissed her. Not the gentle, almost paternal kiss he had pressed to her forehead the night before, but a real kiss, tentative at first, and then with growing certainty as she responded. It lasted only a moment before he pulled back, his eyes wide with something that might have been shock or regret. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I shouldn't have." "Don't apologize," she whispered. "Please don't apologize." But he was already pulling away, already rebuilding the walls that had come down in that moment of vulnerability. "It's late. You should get some rest." He left her standing in the kitchen, her fingers pressed to her lips and her heart hammering against her ribs. From upstairs came the sound of his door closing with finality, but it was hours before she heard his footsteps stop pacing across the floor above her head. That night, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Maybelle allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to truly belong here, not as a purchased convenience or a temporary solution to loneliness, but as a woman loved and cherished by the complex, wounded man who had brought her to this beautiful, isolated place. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The morning after the kiss dawned gray and subdued, matching the atmosphere that had settled over the house like a heavy blanket. Maybelle woke before sunrise, as had become her habit. But instead of the usual sense of purpose that accompanied her mornings, she felt uncertain and off balance, as if the very ground beneath her feet had shifted during the night. She dressed carefully in her blue cotton dress, the same one she had worn on that first day, though it had been mended and altered to fit her better, and made her way downstairs to find Colt already in the kitchen, fully dressed despite the early hour. His right arm was held stiffly against his body, favoring the injured shoulder, but otherwise he appeared unchanged from the man she had known before that moment of vulnerability had cracked open between them. "Good morning," she said quietly, moving to the stove to begin breakfast preparations. "Morning." His voice was carefully neutral, polite but distant, and her heart sank even as she had expected it. They moved around each other with the awkward precision of dancers who had forgotten their steps, each hyper-aware of the other's presence while trying to pretend that nothing had changed. Colt sat at the table with his coffee, reading a week-old newspaper with studied concentration, while Maybelle prepared eggs and bacon with more attention than the simple task required. "How's your shoulder?" she asked as she set his plate before him, her fingers carefully avoiding any contact with his. "Fine. Healing well, thanks to your ministrations." He looked up briefly, and she caught a glimpse of something complicated in his pale eyes before he looked away again. "You did good work." The compliment warmed her more than it should have, given the careful distance in his voice. She took her seat across from him and tried to eat, though the food tasted like sawdust in her mouth. After breakfast, Colt rose with obvious reluctance. "I should check the cattle in the near pasture, make sure none wandered off during the storm." "Should you be riding with that shoulder?" "I'll manage." His tone was final, brooking no argument. "I'll be back before dark." And he was gone, leaving Maybelle alone with the echo of his words, and the growing certainty that whatever had begun to bloom between them the night before was being ruthlessly pruned back before it could take root. But if Colt thought that pretending nothing had changed would make it so, he had underestimated both the stubborn streak Maybelle had inherited from her Irish grandmother and the effect his kiss had had on her carefully guarded heart. She spent the morning attacking the house with renewed vigor, scrubbing floors that were already clean and reorganizing cupboards that were already tidy. It was while she was washing windows in the front room that she discovered the photograph tucked behind a book on the mantelpiece, a formal portrait of Colt and Elizabeth on their wedding day. Elizabeth had been beautiful in the way that made men write poetry and fight duels, golden hair piled high, delicate features, and eyes that sparkled with life even in the sepia tones of the photograph. She wore a dress of white silk with intricate lacework, and her smile was radiant with joy and certainty about her future. Beside her, Colt looked younger, less weathered by grief and solitude. His arm was around his bride's waist, and he was looking down at her with an expression of such tender adoration that it made Maybelle's chest ache with a complex mixture of jealousy and sympathy. This was what real love looked like, not the careful transaction that had brought her to this place, but the kind of soul-deep connection that poets wrote about and that most people could only dream of finding. No wonder he kept himself locked away from the possibility of feeling again. How could any emotion compare to what was captured in that photograph? She was still holding the picture when she heard Colt's boots on the front porch. "Quickly!" She set it back in its hiding place and tried to look busy, but he had seen her examining it. "I was just dusting," she said, the lie falling flat between them. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, his eyes moving from her face to the mantelpiece and back again. "She was beautiful," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Yes, she was." Maybelle turned to face him fully. "You must have loved her very much." "I did." The simple admission hung in the air between them like a challenge. "More than I thought it was possible to love another person." The words cut deeper than they should have, confirming what she had already known but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. She was not Elizabeth, would never be Elizabeth, could never inspire that kind of devotion in this complicated, wounded man. "I see," she said quietly, and perhaps he heard something in her voice because his expression softened slightly. "Maybelle," It's all right. She managed a smile that felt like it might crack her face. I understand. But she didn't understand. Not really. And the rest of the day passed in a haze of hurt and confusion. She prepared supper mechanically, responded to Colt's careful attempts at conversation with monosyllables, and excused herself to bed early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated. That night, she lay in Elizabeth's bed and stared at the ceiling, wondering how long she could continue living in the shadow of a ghost, being grateful for scraps of attention from a man who would never see her as anything more than a pale substitute for what he had lost. The answer came to her with startling clarity. She couldn't, not anymore. Not after that kiss had shown her what it might feel like to be truly wanted, even if only for a moment. The next morning, she woke with a sense of resolution that surprised her with its strength. If Colt was determined to keep her at arm's length, to treat her as nothing more than a housekeeper who happened to share his name, then she would stop hoping for more. She would do her job, keep his house, tend his needs, and protect her heart from further damage. But Colt, it seemed, had other plans. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when he appeared beside her, moving with the silent grace that had probably made him a formidable opponent in whatever conflicts had marked him before he became a rancher. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "About what?" She didn't look at him, focusing instead on shaking out one of his shirts before pinning it to the line. "About last night. About what happened between us." Nothing happened between us. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she forced herself to say it. "You were hurt, I helped you, and then you kissed me because you were grateful or confused or because I wanted to." The simple statement stopped her cold. She turned to face him, the wet shirt still clutched in her hands. "What?" "I kissed you because I wanted to," he repeated, his pale eyes steady on her face. "Not because I was grateful or confused, or because you reminded me of someone else. Because in that moment, I wanted you more than I'd wanted anything in 5 years. The honesty in his voice, the raw vulnerability of the admission, took her breath away. "Colt, let me finish." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the tiny lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. "I've been telling myself it was a mistake, that it can't happen again, that it wouldn't be fair to you or to her memory. But I'm tired of lying to myself. And I'm tired of pretending that what I feel for you is anything less than real." "What do you feel for me?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. He reached out and took the shirt from her nerveless fingers, dropping it back into the basket before cupping her face in his hands with infinite gentleness. "I feel like I'm waking up after a long sleep," he said softly. "Like I've been holding my breath for 5 years and can finally exhale. Like maybe there's still a chance for happiness in this world, if I'm brave enough to reach for it." Before she could respond, he kissed her again, not the desperate, almost accidental kiss of the night before, but something deeper and more purposeful. This kiss spoke of choice rather than impulse, of a man who had wrestled with his demons and emerged victorious. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Maybelle found tears on her cheeks that she didn't remember shedding. "I don't want to be her replacement," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I can't compete with a ghost. Colt, I won't spend my life trying to be someone I'm not. I'm not asking you to be anyone but yourself." His thumbs brushed away her tears with exquisite care. "Elizabeth was the love of my youth, bright and fierce and full of dreams. But you..." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "You're the woman who brought me back to life. You're the one who made me remember that I'm more than just my grief." The declaration hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. Maybelle searched his face for any sign of doubt or reservation and found none. "What does this mean for us?" she asked. "It means we stop pretending this is just a business arrangement," he said, his hands still framing her face. "It means we try to build something real together, if you're willing." "I'm willing," she whispered, and felt something tight and painful in her chest finally begin to loosen. This time when he kissed her, She kissed him back with all the longing and hope she had been holding in check since that first day. And when he pulled her against him, careful of his injured shoulder but unwilling to let distance remain between them, she felt for the first time since arriving at the ranch that she was truly home. That evening, they sat together at the kitchen table, not as employer and employee, or even as reluctant housemates, but as something new and fragile and infinitely precious. Colt reached across the table to take her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers as naturally as breathing. "We'll take it slow," he said, though his eyes held promises that made her pulse quicken. "There's no rush. We have all the time in the world to figure out what this is, what we want it to become." Maybelle squeezed his hand and smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "All the time in the world," she agreed. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. But inside the house that had once felt like a tomb, two wounded souls had found something neither had dared hope for: a second chance at love, and the courage to take it. The weeks that followed their tentative understanding unfolded like pages in a book that Maybelle had never dared to imagine herself reading. The careful distance that had defined their relationship dissolved gradually, replaced by something warmer and infinitely more complex. Colt began spending his evenings in the front room rather than disappearing into his study, and Maybelle would join him there after the supper dishes were done. He had discovered a trunk of books that had belonged to Elizabeth, volumes of poetry by Longfellow and Whittier, novels by Dickens and Cooper, and collections of essays that spoke of a woman with an educated mind and romantic sensibilities. She loved to read aloud, Colt said one evening as Maybelle examined a well-worn copy of Jane Eyre. Said the words sounded different when they were shared, that they meant more somehow. "Would you like me to read to you?" The offer was tentative, testing the boundaries of this new territory they were exploring together. His answer was a slow smile that transformed his entire face. "I'd like that very much." And so a new ritual was born. Each evening, as the fire crackled in the grate and the wind whispered through the pines outside, Maybelle would read aloud while Colt worked on small repairs or simply listened, his pale eyes fixed on her face with an attention that made her acutely aware of every word she spoke. It was during one of these evenings that she began to notice the changes in herself as well. The frightened, resigned girl who had been sold like chattel had been replaced by a woman who laughed at Colt's dry observations about the characters in their books, who offered her own opinions about the stories they shared, who felt herself blossoming under the warmth of his growing attention. She had also begun keeping a journal, writing by candlelight in Elizabeth's room after Colt had retired for the night. The entries started as simple records of daily events: the weather, the household tasks completed, the small victories and setbacks of ranch life. But gradually, they became more personal, more revealing. November 15th, 1883 C. Smiled at breakfast today when I told him about the hen who has been laying her eggs in the barn loft. A real smile, not the careful one he uses when he's being polite. It changes his whole face, makes him look younger, less burdened. I find myself thinking of ways to make him smile like that more often. November the 22nd, 1883. We rode to the south pasture together today to check on the cattle. C is teaching me to read the signs of weather in the clouds and the behavior of the animals. Says a rancher's wife needs to understand the land as well as her husband does. Rancher's wife. The words made my heart skip, though I tried not to let it show. It was the beginning of December when everything changed again, though not in the way Maybelle had begun to hope it might. She was in the kitchen preparing supper when she heard the sound of horses approaching the house. Not the familiar rhythm of Colt returning from his work, but multiple animals moving at an unsteady pace. Through the window, she saw two figures dismounting in the front yard. Her father, Ezra O'Connor, swaying slightly from drink even as he tried to maintain his dignity, and another man she didn't recognize, lean and sharp-featured with the predatory look of someone who lived by his wits and other people's weaknesses. Her blood ran cold as she watched Ezra pound on the front door with unnecessary force, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Hartley, I know you're in there. We got business to discuss." Maybelle's hands shook as she wiped them on her apron and moved toward the door. She had known this day might come, had feared it in her quieter moments, but she hadn't expected it to arrive when she was just beginning to believe in the possibility of happiness. "Pa!" She opened the door and stepped onto the porch, positioning herself between the two men and the house. "What are you doing here?" Ezra's bloodshot eyes fixed on her with the calculating look she remembered from her childhood, the expression he wore when he was planning something that would benefit him at someone else's expense. "There's my girl," he said with false heartiness. "Don't you look fine? Ranch life agrees with you. I can see that plain as day." "You shouldn't be here," Maybelle said quietly, glancing nervously toward the barn where Colt was working. "You made your choice, took your payment. I don't belong to you anymore. Now, that's where you're wrong. Daughter." Ezra pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, waving it in the air like a banner. "See, I've been thinking about our arrangement with Mr. Hartley, and I realized I might have been a bit hasty in my negotiations." The other man stepped forward, his smile revealing teeth that were surprisingly white in his weathered face. "Miss O'Connor, I presume? I'm Samuel Briggs, attorney at law. Your father has engaged my services regarding certain irregularities in his transaction with Mr. Hartley." "What kind of irregularities?" The question came from behind Maybelle, and she turned to see Colt emerging from the barn, his face hard with an anger she had never seen before. "Ah, Hartley." Ezra's voice took on the wheedling tone that always preceded his worst behavior. "Just the man I wanted to see. You and I need to have a little conversation about my daughter here." "We had our conversation months ago," Colt replied, moving to stand beside Maybelle, his presence solid and reassuring. "As I recall, you were quite satisfied with the terms. That was before I understood the full implications of the arrangement." Briggs interjected smoothly. "You see, Mr. Hartley, a father cannot simply sell his daughter like livestock, regardless of any financial considerations that may have changed hands. Such transactions are illegal in the Arizona territory, as I'm sure you're aware." Maybelle felt the blood drain from her face. She had been so focused on her own feelings, on the growing connection between herself and Colt, that she had never considered the legal ramifications of her presence at the ranch. "What do you want?" Colt's voice was deadly quiet. "Nothing unreasonable," Ezra said quickly. "Just a fair adjustment to our original agreement. See, I've got debts that have come due sooner than expected, and I find myself in need of additional funds. Say, $200 ought to cover it. And if I refuse," Briggs smiled his predatory smile, "then I'm afraid we'll have to involve the territorial authorities. Imagine the scandal. Mr. Hartley, a respected rancher accused of purchasing a young woman for immoral purposes. Even if the charges didn't stick, the damage to your reputation would be considerable." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Maybelle felt sick, understanding with crystal clarity that her father was prepared to destroy any chance of happiness she might have found in order to line his own pockets. "You bastard," she whispered, the word torn from her with more pain than anger. "Now, Maybelle, that's no way to talk to your old PA," Ezra said, but his eyes were fixed on Colt, watching for signs of capitulation. "She's right," Colt said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had made a decision. "You are a bastard, O'Connor, and you." He turned to Briggs. "Are a vulture feeding on misery. Strong words, Mr. Hartley, but get off my land." The command cut through whatever Briggs had been about to say. "Both of you, now!" Ezra's face flushed red with indignation. "You can't just—" "I can, and I will." Colt's hand moved to rest on the grip of his pistol, the gesture casual but unmistakable. "You've got 30 seconds to mount up and ride out, or I'll shoot you for trespassing. You're making a mistake. Hartley," Briggs said, backing toward his horse. "We'll be back with the sheriff, and then Then you'll find out what happens to men who threaten my wife." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Wife. Not arrangement, not transaction, not business agreement. Wife. Maybelle's heart stopped, then began beating so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Colt's eyes met hers for just a moment, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. Not just protection or duty, but something deeper, something that looked remarkably like the emotion she had been afraid to name even to herself. Ezra and Briggs exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by this development. "You married her?" Ezra demanded. "When? There's no record." "Common law marriage is legal in the territory," Colt replied evenly. "Has been for over a year. Miss O'Connor became Mrs. Hartley the moment she agreed to be my wife and took up residence in my home." It wasn't true. Of course, they had never spoken vows, had barely kissed, were still finding their way towards something that might someday become love. But the lie rolled off Colt's tongue with such conviction that even Maybelle almost believed it. That's not how it works." Briggs sputtered, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Isn't it?" Colt's smile was cold as winter wind. "I suggest you check your law books more carefully, counselor, and while you're at it, you might want to research the penalties for attempted extortion and conspiracy to commit fraud." The two men remounted their horses with obvious reluctance. Ezra's face twisted with rage and disappointment. As they prepared to ride away, he turned back to his daughter with venom in his voice. "This ain't over, girl. You belong to me until you're legally wed, and I'll get what's owed me one way or another." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Colt said quietly. "She never did, and if you come back here again, you'll find out just how serious I am about protecting what's mine." They watched until the two figures disappeared over the ridge, then stood in silence as the reality of what had just happened settled over them. Finally, Colt turned to her, his face grave. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have claimed you were my wife without asking. But it was the only way I could think of to—" "Don't apologize." The words came out fiercer than she had intended. "Please don't apologize for defending me. They'll be back," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting immediate pursuit. "Maybe not today or tomorrow, but they'll be back. Men like that don't give up easily when they smell money." Maybelle felt something cold and hard settle in her chest as she realized the truth of his words. Her father would never stop, would never let her live in peace, as long as he thought there was profit to be made from her misery. "What can we do?" Colt was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he considered their options. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "We could make it real," he said. "Get properly married, make the common law claim legitimate. It would give you legal protection, make it much harder for him to cause trouble." The offer hung between them, practical and bloodless. A marriage of convenience to solve a legal problem. Nothing more. "Is that what you want?" she asked, her heart breaking a little at the thought of reducing what had been growing between them to a mere legal maneuver. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw past the careful control to the vulnerability beneath. "What I want," he said slowly, "is to keep you safe. What I want is to never see that look of fear in your eyes again. What I want is to wake up every morning knowing that you're here because you choose to be, not because you have nowhere else to go." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was something precious nonetheless. A promise, a commitment, a foundation upon which something stronger might be built. "Then yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's make it real." That night, they sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table, the space between them feeling both vast and intimate. Neither had spoken much since making their decision, both lost in contemplation of how dramatically their lives were about to change. Finally, Colt broke the silence. "We'll go to town tomorrow," he said. "See the preacher, file the papers, make it official." Maybelle nodded, then found herself asking the question that had been haunting her since her father's visit. "Do you think it will work? Will it really protect me from him?" "It will work," Colt said with quiet certainty. "I give you my word on that." As she prepared for bed that night, Maybelle caught sight of herself in Elizabeth's mirror and was startled by what she saw there. Gone was the frightened girl who had arrived at the ranch months ago. In her place was a woman, still young, still uncertain about many things, but with a strength in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Colt Hartley in truth as well as name. It might not be the romantic wedding she had dreamed of as a child, but it would be real. And it would be hers, and perhaps, given time and patience and the fragile trust that was growing between them, it might become something even more precious than she dared to hope. The ride to Copper Creek the next morning was tense with unspoken anxieties and fragile hopes. Maybelle sat astride Rosie with the careful posture Colt had taught her, but her mind was far from the mechanics of horsemanship. In the saddlebags were her few precious possessions, her mother's Bible, the tablecloth she had been embroidering, and the journal where she had been documenting the slow transformation of her heart. Colt rode beside her on Ranger, his eyes constantly scanning the trail ahead and behind them. He had strapped on his gun that morning with particular care, and Maybelle noticed the way his hand rested near the weapon, ready for trouble that might come from any direction. They spoke little during the journey, each lost in private thoughts about what lay ahead. The marriage ceremony would be simple, practical, a legal formality designed to protect her from her father's schemes. But Maybelle found herself wondering what it would be like to stand beside this complex, wounded man and speak vows that carried real meaning, real commitment. The town of Copper Creek looked smaller and more squalid than she remembered, its dusty main street lined with weathered buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support. The saloon was already busy despite the early hour, and she could hear the tinny sound of an off-key piano drifting through the bat-wing doors. They made their way to the small church at the end of the street, where Reverend Morrison maintained his modest congregation and performed the occasional wedding or funeral for those who could afford his services. The building was simple but clean, with white-painted walls and windows that let in the morning light. Reverend Morrison was a thin man in his 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that shook slightly when he wasn't concentrating on keeping them still. He greeted them warmly, though Maybelle caught him glancing between her and Colt with curious speculation. "Mr. Hartley," he said, extending his hand. "It's been too long since we've seen you in town, and this must be Miss O'Connor, whom I understand is to become Mrs. Hartley today." "That's right, Reverend," Colt replied. "We'd like to keep things simple, if that's agreeable to you." Of course, though I must say, it's always a joy to see two souls finding happiness together." The old man's eyes crinkled with genuine warmth. "Do you have witnesses?" Maybelle felt her heart sink. In her anxiety about the legal aspects of their situation, she hadn't thought about the social requirements of a wedding ceremony. We don't really know anyone in town well enough to—" "Nonsense," came a voice from the back of the church, and Maybelle turned to see a woman approaching them with brisk efficiency. She was perhaps 45, with graying brown hair pinned back severely and wearing a practical dress that had seen better days but was scrupulously clean. "Martha Patterson," the woman introduced herself, extending a work-roughened hand. "I run the boarding house down the street. Reverend Morrison here mentioned you might need witnesses, and I'd be honored to stand up for you." Before anyone could respond, the church door opened again to admit a tall, lanky man with a sheriff's star pinned to his vest. Maybelle's blood ran cold, fearing that her father had somehow managed to involve the law already, but the newcomer's expression was friendly rather than official. "Tom Bradley," he said, nodding to Colt. "Heard through the grapevine that we had a wedding happening today. Hope you don't mind me volunteering as your second witness. Always did like a good celebration." The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike, yet somehow more moving than Maybelle had expected. Standing beside Colt in the simple church, with morning sunlight streaming through the windows and the scent of pine wafting in on the mountain breeze, she felt the weight of the moment settling over her like a blessing. When Reverend Morrison asked if she took Colt to be her husband, her voice was steady and clear as she said, "I do." And when Colt spoke the same words, looking directly into her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch, she almost believed that this was more than just a legal convenience. The kiss that sealed their union was gentle and brief, appropriate for the public setting, but Maybelle felt something shift between them as their lips met, a sense of commitment that went deeper than mere legal protection. "Well now," Sheriff Bradley said as they signed the marriage certificate, "I suppose this calls for a celebration. Martha, what do you say we treat these newlyweds to dinner at your place?" "I'd be delighted," Martha replied warmly. "It's not often we get to witness such happiness." The meal at Martha's boarding house was simple but hearty: roast beef with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread, and apple pie that reminded Maybelle painfully of her mother's cooking. The conversation flowed more easily than she had expected, with Martha regaling them with stories of her years running the boarding house and Sheriff Bradley sharing amusing anecdotes about keeping the peace in a frontier town. It was while they were finishing their pie that trouble found them. The boarding house door burst open with enough force to rattle the windows, and Ezra O'Connor stumbled inside, clearly having spent the morning hours in the saloon. Behind him came Samuel Briggs, looking marginally more sober but no less determined. "There she is!" Ezra shouted, pointing an unsteady finger at Maybelle. "My daughter, stolen away by this here rancher." The pleasant atmosphere in the dining room evaporated instantly. Sheriff Bradley rose slowly from his chair, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Mr. O'Connor," he said in the calm voice of a man accustomed to dealing with drunks and troublemakers, "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice and state your business in a civil manner." "My business is with him," Ezra snarled, his bloodshot eyes fixed on Colt with naked hatred. "He stole my girl, and I want her back." "Actually," Briggs interrupted, producing a folded document from his coat, "we have a legal complaint to file. Mr. Hartley has unlawfully abducted Miss O'Connor and is holding her against her will." Sheriff Bradley accepted the paper and examined it with the careful attention of a man who had learned not to rush to judgment. "This is dated yesterday," he observed, "and it refers to a Miss O'Connor." "That's right," Briggs said smugly. "Miss Maybelle O'Connor, unlawfully detained by one Colt Hartley of—" "There's no Miss O'Connor here," the sheriff interrupted mildly. "Only Mrs. Hartley, who was lawfully married to Mr. Hartley this morning in the presence of myself and Mrs. Patterson as witnesses." The silence that followed was deafening. Ezra's face went through a series of colors, from red to purple to an unhealthy gray, while Briggs stared at the marriage certificate that Reverend Morrison had helpfully produced from his coat pocket. That's impossible," Ezra stammered. "She can't marry without my consent. She's my daughter. My property. She's 19 years old," Sheriff Bradley said firmly, "well past the age of consent in this territory, and she's now Mrs. Colt Hartley, with all the legal protections that marriage provides." Ezra's composure finally shattered completely. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he screamed at Colt. "Think you can just take what's mine and get away with it? Well, let me tell you something about your precious husband. Girl, he's a killer. He murdered his first wife, shot her down in cold blood because she was carrying another man's child." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Maybelle felt the blood drain from her face as she saw the stricken expression that crossed Colt's features. Not guilt, but pain so deep and raw that it made her chest ache in sympathy. "That's enough," Sheriff Bradley said sharply. But Ezra was beyond reason now, fueled by alcohol and rage and the bitter taste of defeat. "Ask him," Ezra continued, jabbing his finger toward Colt. "Ask him how his wife really died. Ask him why he lives up there all alone like a hermit. It's because everyone knows what he did." "It's not true," Maybelle said, her voice shaking but determined. She moved to stand beside Colt, her hand finding his arm in a gesture of support. "Whatever you think you know, you're wrong." But Colt was staring at her with an expression of such profound sadness that her heart almost stopped. "Maybelle," he said quietly, "maybe you should hear this. Maybe you deserve to know the truth before you decide whether you want to stay married to me." "The truth?" Ezra laughed bitterly. The truth is that Elizabeth Hartley was found shot dead in a canyon 5 years ago, and the only other person there was her husband. The truth is that she was 3 months pregnant, and the baby wasn't his because he'd been away on a cattle drive when it was conceived. The truth is that he killed her rather than raise another man's bastard. "Stop it!" Maybelle's voice cut through the accusations like a whip crack. "I don't care what lies you want to tell or what poison you want to spread. Colt is my husband now, and I trust him more than I've ever trusted anyone in my life." "Then you're a fool," Briggs said coldly. The evidence, Sheriff Bradley interrupted, "was examined thoroughly 5 years ago. Mr. Hartley was never charged with any crime because there was no crime committed. Elizabeth Hartley died in a riding accident, thrown from her horse in difficult terrain. The coroner's report was quite clear on that point. But the baby," Ezra started, "was premature." The sheriff continued implacably. "Born too early to survive, which can happen when a pregnant woman suffers a severe fall. Mr. Hartley was cleared of any wrongdoing by a thorough investigation." The wind went out of Ezra's sails like a punctured balloon. He stared at the sheriff, then at Colt, then at his daughter, seeming to realize for the first time that his schemes had failed completely. "But I need the money," he said plaintively. All the fight gone out of him. "I got debts, threats. They'll kill me if I don't pay." For a moment, looking at this broken, pathetic man who had sold his own daughter for drinking money, Maybelle felt something almost like pity. But then she remembered the years of fear and neglect, the way he had treated her like property to be disposed of at his convenience. And her heart hardened. "That's not my problem anymore," she said quietly. "I'm not your daughter anymore. Pa, I'm Colt's wife, and this is my family now." Ezra's face crumpled like paper. Without another word, he turned and stumbled out of the boarding house, Briggs following with obvious reluctance. Through the window, they watched the two men mount their horses and ride out of town, and out of Maybelle's life. In the silence that followed their departure, Colt turned to her with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly. "Stand up for me like that, especially after what he said about Elizabeth." "Yes, I did," she replied, moving closer to him. "You're my husband. That means something, even if we didn't marry for the usual reasons." "Maybelle," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "there are things about Elizabeth's death, about that whole time, that I've never talked about with anyone. Things that still keep me awake at night. If you want to know, only if you want to tell me," she interrupted gently. "And only when you're ready. I meant what I said. I trust you. That trust isn't conditional on explanations or confessions or anything else." He stared at her for a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Then, without warning, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that took her breath away. Not the careful, tentative kisses they had shared before, but something desperate and grateful and full of promises neither of them had dared to voice. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat diplomatically. "Well," he said with a grin, "I'd say this marriage is off to a promising start." As they rode home in the late afternoon light, Maybelle felt a sense of completion she had never experienced before. She was truly Mrs. Colt Hartley now, bound to this complex, wounded man by more than just legal documents. She was bound by choice, by trust, by the growing certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And for the first time since her mother's death, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The winter that followed their marriage was unlike any Maybelle had ever known. Snow fell in earnest by mid-December, blanketing the ranch in pristine white that transformed the harsh landscape into something magical and serene. The isolation that had once felt oppressive now became a cocoon of intimacy, wrapping her and Colt in a world that belonged entirely to them. Their relationship deepened gradually, like ice slowly giving way to spring warmth. The legal formality of their marriage had removed the barriers of uncertainty and fear, allowing genuine affection to flourish in its place. Colt began sharing stories of his childhood in Missouri, of the dreams that had brought him west, of the years of hard work that had built the ranch into the prosperous operation it had become. One evening in late December, as they sat before the fire with Maybelle reading aloud from a collection of Robert Burns' poetry, Colt interrupted her mid-verse. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of long-carried secrets. "About Elizabeth. About what really happened that day she died." Maybelle closed the book and gave him her full attention, seeing in his face the struggle between his desire to be honest with her and his reluctance to revisit painful memories. "We had been trying to have a child for 3 years. He began slowly. Every month brought hope, then disappointment. The doctor in town suggested that perhaps the problem was with me, that I might never be able to give her the family she wanted so desperately." He stared into the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows across his weathered features. "When she told me she was expecting, I was overjoyed. It seemed like a miracle, an answer to prayers. I didn't question the timing, didn't think about the fact that I had been away for 6 weeks driving cattle to market in Colorado." Maybelle felt her heart clench, understanding now the true source of his torment. She knew I would figure it out eventually. He continued. "The dates, the timing. It would have become obvious as the pregnancy progressed. That morning, she came to me in tears, confessed everything, said she had been lonely, that a traveling preacher had come through while I was away, and she had made a terrible mistake." "Oh, Colt," Maybelle whispered, reaching for his hand. She was terrified I would throw her out, leave her to face the shame alone. But all I could think about was that we were finally going to have a child, that it didn't matter how it had come to be. I told her we would raise the baby as our own, that no one else ever needed to know the truth. His voice broke slightly as he continued. She was so relieved, so grateful. She wanted to go for a ride to celebrate, to feel free again after carrying the burden of guilt for months. I should have said no, should have insisted it was too dangerous in her condition. But she looked so happy, and I couldn't bear to deny her anything. The rest of the story came out in painful fragments. How Elizabeth's horse had spooked at a rattlesnake, how she had been thrown against the rocks of a narrow canyon, how Colt had held her as she died, her blood staining his shirt while he whispered promises that it would all be all right. "The baby came too early, lived only a few minutes," he finished, his voice barely audible. "I buried them together on the hill overlooking the south pasture, under the oak tree where she used to sit and read. And then I came home and tried to pretend that my heart hadn't died with them." Maybelle was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the depth of his pain and understanding at last why he had isolated himself so completely. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "You couldn't have saved her. Colt, what happened was a tragedy, not your fault. I should have been a better husband. Should have been home more. Should have given her the attention she needed." "She made her choice," Maybelle interrupted. "A poor choice, perhaps, but hers to make. And when she came to you with the truth, you responded with forgiveness and love. Not every man would have done that." He looked at her then, his pale eyes searching her face for signs of judgment or disgust, and finding only compassion and understanding. "How can you say that? How can you sit there and tell me I'm not to blame when another man's betrayal is what killed my wife?" "Because I know you," she said simply. "I've seen how gentle you are with injured animals, how carefully you tend to everything under your care. I've watched you teach me to ride and shoot, not because you had to, but because you wanted me to be safe and strong. You're not a man who destroys things, Colt. You're a man who protects them." The tears that had been threatening finally spilled over, running down his weathered cheeks like silver in the firelight. Without hesitation, Maybelle moved from her chair to the sofa beside him, gathering him into her arms as he wept for the wife he had lost, and the guilt he had carried for 5 long years. When the storm of grief finally passed, they remained entwined on the sofa, her fingers combing gently through his hair as he rested his head against her shoulder. "I love you," he said quietly, the words muffled against her neck. I never thought I'd be able to say that to another woman. Never thought I'd want to, but I love you. Maybelle, more than I thought it was possible to love someone again. I love you too, she whispered back, the words feeling like a homecoming. I think I have for a long time, but I was afraid to hope. He lifted his head to look at her, his eyes bright with tears and something else, something that looked remarkably like joy. We're really married now, aren't we? Not just legally, but in every way that matters. Yes, she said, smiling through her own tears. We really are. The kiss that followed was different from any they had shared before. Not desperate or careful or born of crisis, but tender and sure and full of promises for the future. When it ended, they remained close, foreheads touching, breathing the same air. I want to show you something, Colt said eventually, rising and extending his hand to her. He led her upstairs to his bedroom, the master bedroom she had never entered, had assumed was still too much of a shrine to Elizabeth's memory for her to be welcome there. But when he opened the door, she was surprised to find it stripped of feminine touches, the surfaces clear of photographs and personal mementos. I put her things away last month, he explained, seeing her confusion. Not to forget her, but to make room for us, for our life together. This is our room now, if you want it to be. The gesture moved her more than any declaration of love could have. This was his offering, not just his heart, but his home, his future, everything he had to give. I want it to be, she said softly. That night, for the first time since arriving at the ranch. Maybelle did not sleep alone in Elizabeth's room. She lay beside her husband in the master bedroom, her head on his shoulder, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and feeling more at peace than she had ever thought possible. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed to permeate every aspect of their lives. Colt began making plans to expand the ranch, talking about building a proper schoolhouse for the children of the scattered homesteaders in the valley. Maybelle threw herself into the project with enthusiasm, organizing supplies and reaching out to families who had been isolated by distance and circumstance. The one-room schoolhouse they built together became a symbol of their commitment not just to each other, but to the community they were helping to create. Every Sunday, families would gather there for informal services led by whoever felt moved to speak, followed by shared meals and the kind of fellowship that transformed a collection of isolated homesteads into a real neighborhood. It was during one of these Sunday gatherings in early May that Maybelle realized she had something important to tell her husband. She had been feeling unwell in the mornings, had noticed changes in her body that spoke of possibilities she had hardly dared to consider. That evening, after their guests had departed and they were cleaning up the remnants of the communal meal, she found the courage to speak. Colt, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I believe I might be with child. He went very still, a plate frozen halfway to the wash basin. For a moment she feared she had made a mistake, that the prospect of another child would bring back too many painful memories. But when he turned to her, his face was radiant with a joy so pure and intense it took her breath away. Are you certain? He asked, setting down the plate and moving toward her with careful steps, as if she were made of spun glass. As certain as I can be. It's still early, but the signs. She trailed off, suddenly shy about discussing such intimate matters even with her husband. He gathered her into his arms with infinite gentleness, his hand coming to rest on her still flat stomach. Our child, he said wonderingly. Our baby. Are you happy? She asked, needing to hear the words. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I never dared hope. After everything that happened before, I thought perhaps God didn't intend for me to be a father. Well, it seems he has other plans, Maybelle said with a smile. They stood together in their kitchen as the sun set behind the mountains. Two people who had found their way to love through loss and pain, and the stubborn refusal to give up on the possibility of happiness. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and the last light of day painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Do you ever regret it?" Colt asked quietly. "Coming here, marrying me, taking on all of this?" Maybelle considered the question seriously, thinking of the frightened girl who had arrived at the ranch nearly a year ago, thinking of all the ways her life had changed since that first day. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me a home. Colt, more than that, you gave me a family, a purpose, a future I never could have imagined for myself." "You gave me those things too," he replied. "You brought me back to life when I thought I was finished living." As they sat on the front porch that evening, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky, Maybelle reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. It had begun with a transaction, a desperate father selling his daughter to pay his debts. But it had become something infinitely more precious, a love story written in the language of second chances and hard-won happiness. The child growing within her stirred slightly, as if responding to her thoughts, and she placed her hand over Colt's where it rested on her belly. Their baby would be born into a world of love and security, surrounded by the vast beauty of the Arizona Territory and the unshakable bond between parents who had fought for their right to happiness. "I love you, Mrs. Hartley," Colt said, his lips brushing against her temple. "And I love you, Mr. Hartley," she replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Now and always." In the distance, a coyote howled its ancient song to the moon. But the sound no longer seemed lonely to Maybelle. Instead, it seemed like a celebration, a wild hymn of joy for two souls who had found their way home to each other in this beautiful, unforgiving land where only the strongest love could survive and flourish. Thank you for joining us around the campfire tonight for this tale of love found in the most unexpected places. Whether you're listening from your own frontier cabin, a bustling city apartment, or somewhere in between, we'd love to hear where this story has reached you. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales of romance, redemption, and the untamed American frontier. And share your thoughts about Colt and Maybelle's journey in the comments below.